Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So it's a pleasure to, it's a pleasure to have Sid Redner here. I've known Sid for a really long time, right? Probably around 1980 or something.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah, really, really long time. It's kind of scary. So, I mean, it's scary for me. It's not scary for him. It's scary for... Well, no, it's scary... Well, I didn't mean that anyway. Dynamics of friendship and hatred. So, Sid is a physicist, and so this will be a physics talk, so he'll give models and stuff. He won't give proofs, which is probably just what the psychologists and social scientists in the audience want, because you wouldn't want detailed proofs of all this stuff. And then the mathematicians here can maybe...
prove everything.
Prove everything, right, which would be nice. Okay, so it's a pleasure to have Sid, and hopefully all children are far away from fire alarms now. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it is scary that we've known each other for...
27 years.
Yeah. I remember when you used to wear black leather jackets, and it was...
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, so social balance on networks. So the basic question of this talk is that in all kinds of studies of networks, we think that there's links between nodes, and somehow links are good because they increase connectivity, increase communication. But in social networks, we don't all love each other, and sometimes we have hatreds among people. And so how do you navigate a social network when you have to deal with competing friendly and unfriendly relationships? Another way one can put this into context is that this is like the first, what I think is the first attempt to try and include ferromagnetic and antiferromagnetic interactions in the framework of a social network. So we want to understand, how do social networks evolve when you have both friendly and unfriendly relations? Because when you have such relationships, they usually aren't static. You're forced to break ties with somebody or rearrange your relationship structure because it's just untenable to be dealing with competing friendly and unfriendly relations. So there is actually a lot of history of studying the static properties of social networks with friendly and unfriendly relations, going back to Hyder in 1944, who defined this notion of social balance. So I will spend the beginning of the talk defining this and discussing what is known from the point of view of the static properties of the network. And then the main point of this work is to try and endow the network with the simplest possible dynamics, something akin to zero temperature Glauber dynamics of the Ising model. We're trying to just think of the simplest possible situation that allows relationships to change based on some socially reasonable rules, and just ask what happens. And what we're going to find is that there's a phase transition between a utopia-like phase where everybody has friendly relationships to a socially balanced phase where a system will segregate into two cliques where within each clique everybody likes each other, and between cliques everybody hates each other's guts. That is a socially balanced state, and we have a phase transition between these two, and I'll try and describe some of its general features. So the work I'm going to be describing to you is done in collaboration with Tibor Antal, who's now at Harvard, Paul Krapewski, so two wonderful collaborators. This work would not have happened without their wonderful work. Okay, so let's first of all define social balance. And so here's my attempt to define social balance. So hopefully you recognize these people, Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston. And so suppose that you happen to be friends, that you hang out in Hollywood. So you're friends with Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston. And 2 years ago they were a married couple, so they had a friendly link between them. And if you were friendly with both of them, there is a triad of relationships in which you have friendly relations, or you can think of them as ferromagnetic bonds, and everybody is pointing in the same state. They all like each other. And so this triad, or this triangle, is unfrustrated, or in the social parlance, it's called balanced. Then what happened, we all know what happened, they divorced each other. And at this stage of the game, if you still are friends with Brad and Jen, then you go over to Brad's house and he says, you know, that Jen is such a bitch and I can't stand her. And then you go and visit Jen and he says, well, that Brad is such a, you know, whatever, I can't stand him. And, you know, you go, if you try and maintain your relationships with both members of the divorced couple, you just can't stand it because they're always bad-mouthing each other to you. And so what often happens, and it's sort of painful, is that you have to break relationships with one of them. And so in this particular example, you've decided, well, I won't be friends with Jen anymore. I can now be friends with Brad. And so now the two of you can both badmouth Jen. This triangle is now balanced because there are two unfriendly links or two anti-ferromagnetic bonds, depending on which language you prefer. But in this case, if this was a ferromagnetic triangle with two, if these were spins at the edge of the triangle, and so if this was, say, a spin up, and then anti-ferromagnetic interaction here, this would be spin down, there's no frustration. This triad, though, is frustrated because if this was, say, spin up, ferromagnetic interaction here, ferromagnetic interaction here, that would say these should all be spin up, but then this has an anti-ferromagnetic interaction. It doesn't quite fit together. So we can think of this as a frustrated or imbalanced triad. These are unfrustrated triads. So here's the definition. Either 0 unfriendly links or 2 unfriendly links. An even number of unfriendly links leads to social balance. One social balance is everybody's friendly. This one is that 2 people gang up on the third, but at least it's balanced socially, and it's something that can be maintained in the long term. On the other hand, when you have triads which have an odd number of unfriendly links, then it doesn't work. And so these are what are called either imbalanced or frustrated triads. So here's now the definition of social balance. There's an adage, a friend of a friend is my friend, an enemy of my enemy is also my friend. So here, an enemy of an enemy is my friend. On the other hand, the opposite is you have this enemy relationship. So this is the kind of situation I want to now endow with some dynamical behavior and look at how such networks evolve. Let me also give you another amusing application that came out from a workshop I attended at IPAM a couple of months ago. So this is a nice application to violence in Long Beach street gangs. So these sociologists, they somehow went out to Long Beach and said, hey, are you a gang member? And interviewed gang members one by one. Sounds like a very safe job to do. And so what they found here is that each one of these little squares is a gang. So they interviewed a certain number of people in the gang. I don't quite know the details of the methodology, but there was 3 types of relationships that gangs would have with each other. Because gangs are made up of who they are, most gangs hate each other's gangs, and so there's a lot of unfriendly relationship between gangs. There was some gangs that were kind of not so unfriendly, but of course you don't say, oh, well, we like these people, so they were cool with these gangs. And then there was a lot of unknown relationships. But the thing that was, why do we care about this? Because now I'm showing with the same set of gangs the frequency of violence, and this graph is just stolen from these guys' papers, so and it's maybe a little hard to see. The 2 thickest bonds here are the 2 highest frequencies of violence, incidences of violence. And one thing that one sees is that some gangs which don't even know each other, they do fight some amount. But the question was, can we make some prediction about violence frequency and the gang relations? And what turns out is that if you now look carefully at this one link over here and look at the triads that are attached to this link, it turns out there are 3 triads of type 3 with 3 unfriendly links and 1 triad of type 1. And so this is a very unbalanced state. And so here you have a lot of violence. Unfortunately, there's the other place here where there's a lot of violence, and there it's hard to draw it in the triad, so I didn't. But it's the opposite case. There's mostly balanced triads. So, you know, depending on your viewpoint, you could say, well, balance is bad because then you have 2 cliques that hate each other's guts across, and so this social balance is a catalyst for violence. On the other hand, here, if you have a lot of imbalance and nobody really knows where they stand, and so it's a very natural powder keg for violence. This, I would say, is kind of an open area of how to try and take social data with social balance and try and make some predictions or use it as a crime-fighting tool. But I just wanted to show this as a sense of what you might be able to glean from this type of information. All right, so now let me turn to the point of this talk, which is to try and endow this with some dynamics. And so we came up with two different types of rules that we thought were the simplest and most generic types of rules for evolving the networks. The first one is what I call local triad dynamics, and I'll come back to this in a second, what that means. So think in terms of, like, if any of you have worked on the Ising model with Glauber kinetics, it's the same kind of idea. So you want to try and have the simplest possible state-changing move in the state space that's generic and satisfies some basic principles. In our case, what we're going to do is that if we have a large social network with an imbalanced triad, we know from experience that somebody is going to change a relationship inside of the triad. So we pick an imbalanced triad at random, and then we reverse a single link on the triad so that it becomes balanced. So that's all there is to our rule. We have one parameter in this model, which is that there's two ways you can make an imbalanced triad balance. You can either change an unfriendly link to a friendly or vice versa. And so the parameter in the model is this probability P, the probability that an unfriendly link changes to friendly. And so the opposite is friendly goes to unfriendly. And so here's a little cartoon of what happens. If I have a triad of type 1, then with probability P it becomes a friendly triad. Probability 1 minus P, it becomes a triad of type 2. And in the case of a triad delta 3, 3 unfriendly links, then it always goes to a triad of type 2. And the parameter P, in some sense, could be viewed as a tendency for tranquility. If P,
I don't understand your P and 1 minus, because it seems to me that there are two edges which could become unfriendly, so it should be something like
here.
Yeah.
You're talking about here, yes.
So why is the balance P versus 1 minus P and not something like
Well, no. The thing is that I first pick a triad, and then I pick a link to reverse.
I see. So it's okay.
And so the point is that if P is 1/3, then effectively what this rule tells you is that when you see in this situation, you always make an unfriendly link friendly. In this case, it could be either going this way or that way. And when P is 1/3, it's effectively the same as just picking a link at random and flipping it. And so this P equals 1/3, or the value P equals 1/3 could be viewed as like a critical value of tranquility predisposition. And so if P is larger than 1/3, you would tend to generate more friendly links. Otherwise, you tend to generate more unfriendly links. The one other thing about why is this the social graces of the clueless, the point here is that in a large social network, if I happen to be friends with Brad and Jen, I have other friends, and they also have other friends that are all interconnected. So if I just break a relationship inside of that triad without paying attention to anybody else, I could make some other people very unhappy, which could lead to further changes in the social structure. So why we call the social graces of the clueless is that you just pay attention to one triad at a time. And so you're clueless. You don't pay attention to anybody else. And so for the women in the audience, what we mean by clueless is men, right? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So okay. So I'm preaching to the clueless. Okay. So let me now discuss a little bit more about the evolution of the system. And the case that we're going to consider is the simplest geometry, just the complete graph. And what's been left open so far is what happens on more general graphs. But so for a complete graph of n nodes, and we know there's this many links, this many triads. And let me call it, so I'm now just introducing some basic quantities that I'm going to be studying here. So let's look, for example, at, we have some quantities. N sub k is a density of triads of a given type. There's type 0, 1, 2, or 3 for 0, 1, 2, or 3 unfriendly links. And then there's another slightly more subtle quantity, which is a density of triads of type k that are attached to either a positive link or a negative link. And so here comes a little cartoon to try and introduce each of these things, which is if I have a positive link and it's attached to a positive or a triad of type 0, then the number of such triads is this n0 plus. So the plus because it's a balanced triad and it's a triad of type 0. And then here we have an n1 plus for one unfriendly link and two friendly links where I've already sort of focused attention that I want to study this particular link, and so on. N2 plus.
With respect to a particular link.
Exactly so, yes. And then we have the same thing for a negative link. We can have a triad of type 1, 2, or 3, that's attached to a negative link. And so these are kind of like the basic quantities you want to be counting and looking at how they change when I change a single link in the network. Okay, so now with this dynamics that either a friendly link can change to unfriendly or vice versa, then we can define rates of flipping of a I'm looking at the flip rate of now links. So a friendly link can change to a unfriendly link. And what is the rate that this can occur? So friendly changes to unfriendly only when I have a triad of type 1. And the rate at which it occurs is the density of triads of type 1 times 1 minus p, which is the probability that an unfriendly link changed to a friendly. And similarly for the flip rate of a negative link to a positive link. And with these flip rates, now one can write down master equations that describe how the density of triads of each type changes. And so, for example, triad of type 0, how does it change in density? Well, I can take a triad of type 1, so this guy, and I can change an unfriendly link to a friendly. And so that happens with this flip rate, so that's what this guy is, times the density of these triads. And then there's a similar term for changing a triad of type 0 to type 1, and then that contributes to a loss of triads of type 0.
In a discrete model rather than a continuous time model,
Yes.
this would be like the expectation
Yeah,
of these things. And so you're assuming there's enough concentration that you can just look at the expectations.
yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, I'm assuming that I have a large graph, and so I'm not worrying about fluctuations here. I'm only looking at, I mean, this probably should be the average number of, yes. Okay, so, I mean, the thing is that there's a lot of bookkeeping that goes into these equations, and the point is that this all can be easily worked out if you just sit with a sheet of paper and just do a little bit of accounting of the number of triads and number of links, and so very easily you can derive these equations. And so now let me just describe a little bit about the solution to these equations. So the simplest thing one might look at is the steady state, where you set that the time derivatives are all 0. And in the steady state, in order to keep a steady state, the flip rates from plus to minus and minus to plus also have to be equal. And if you plug that into these equations and then do a little bit of fiddling with the equations, one finds out that, first of all, there is this, you can see if I set this equal to 0, I'll have n1 minus is n0 plus, and it kind of holds in general. And then using a little bit more bookkeeping about the relationship between the triads of a given type and the triads of a given type that are attached to a certain type of link, after doing a little bit of rigmarole, one finds in the steady state that the density of triads of a given type just obeys a binomial distribution. It's something probably we could derive without going through a lot of this work, but this comes out at the end of the day. And the other thing is that in a long time limit, and this rho infinity is this quantity which is either 1 if p is larger than 1/2 or less than 1 when p is less than 1/2. So this was a little bit heavy and not so easy to see what's happening. So let me just maybe go right to a figure. So what we find is that even though earlier on I mentioned that there was this critical value of 1/3 that seemed to be demarcating a transition, it turns out that the critical value is 1/2. Above p of 1/2, when it gets utopia, where every link becomes friendly in the long time limit. And so, there's no longer anything to discuss because the network, everybody is friends with everybody else. But for p less than 1/2, one has a steady state where the number of triads of all the...
So what's going on? They're just so fickle that, for p greater than 1/2.
Right. Well, it's just that the tendency for changing an unfriendly link to a friendly link
so everybody gets happy.
Everybody gets happy.
Gets friendly.
That's right. Yeah, so everybody's been...
Yeah, right.
We've all learned to get along with each other.
But your intuition earlier said that it should have been for more than 1/3, it should have been exactly this. But
that's right. Yeah, I'm naively, when we first started playing with the model, we thought, well, the transition was at 1/3, and then when we start plugging into the equations, we see the transition is at 1/2. And I think part of that is just the constraint of, the thing is that the dynamics is triad based rather than link based, and I think that's why the transition's happening at 1/2 rather than 1/3. Anyways, so for p in this range, one sees that there is a steady state density of friendly links, which will approach 1 when I reach 1/2, but there's a certain amount of unfriendliness in the system, and then associated with a certain amount of unfriendliness, one has triads of all different types populating the system. Okay, so that was the steady state, and now let's look at a little bit more detail at how the system reaches the steady state. And this is a little simpler at the beginning to understand what's going on. So let me write down a rate equation for the density of friendly links. So let me call rho the density of friendly links. And how can that change? And so very simply, if I have a triad of type 1 that has 2 friendly links and 1 unfriendly link, so the probability in the steady state of having that is just rho squared times 1 minus rho times 3 for the 3 possible orientations of the unfriendly link. And with the probability p, I change an unhappy link to a friendly link. And so this is the rate at which you increase the density of friendly links. And similarly, you can change a friendly link to an unfriendly link with this rate times the density of that thing occurring. And then one has, if you have a triad of type 3, all links unfriendly, which happens with the probability 1 minus rho cubed, then with probability 1, it changes to a triad of type 2, increasing the density of friendly links. So it's a very simple equation. One simplifies it, one solves it, and so here is the solution to this equation. And so it fits what you might expect, that when p is larger than 1/2, very quickly you approach utopia, exponentially quickly. When p is less than 1/2, so you're biased towards a very unfriendly society, then there is a steady state density that's approached again exponentially quickly. And at 1/2, the density of unfriendly links decays as a power law in time, slow relaxation to utopia. So there's a very rich time-dependent behavior that happens in this model. So let's, all of this stuff here was in the limit of an infinite system, but typically we're dealing with a finite system, and I'd like to understand what happens in a finite system both to connect with simulation and also I think it's more realistic. So let's look what happens in a finite society. And so I want to give a little back-of-the-envelope calculation to understand part of what happens in dealing with the finite society. So let's imagine looking in a one-dimensional axis, which is the number of balanced triads. So at the right end of this axis, where the system is socially, where we reach utopia, where every single triad is happy, then we'll have roughly n cubed over 6 balanced triads and no imbalanced triads. And so suppose that I start somewhere in this state space, and I ask, how does the number of triads evolve? So if p is, and let's talk about the case p less than 1/2. So what I would argue is that one can derive the following random walk picture to figure out the time that it takes to reach a balanced state in a finite society. One thing that I forgot to mention is that in a finite system, since the system is finite, there is an absorbing state of the system which is balance, because once you have balance, there's no way out of it. I mean, when you reach everybody friendly, there's no way out of it. There's nothing to nucleate any unfriendly links. So the question is, how long does it take to reach this particular point? And so if I start, say, at some point in the state space, then if I'm close to balance, so almost all the links are friendly, if I flip one link, since each link is a member of the order of n other triads, if I flip a friendly link, I will typically create n imbalanced triads. So the picture that's here is that if I happen to take a imbalanced triad and flip a link, most of the time I'm going to create n new imbalanced triads, and so I make a step of the order of length n in the wrong direction. It could be that I made just a step in the right direction going this way, but this happens with a very small probability because there's so many more ways to create. When I'm close to balance, there's not many ways to continue making the system more friendly. On the other hand, if I'm way out here where the number of imbalanced triads and balanced triads are roughly the same, when I flip a link, then I create n over 2 new balanced triads, but I've also created n over 2 new imbalanced triads. So I'm making basically an isotropic random walk of step size n. So if this is my picture, that I have a random walk which is isotropic at this end, but I don't care what's happening here, but what's more relevant is what's happening here, where it's a biased random walk away from the origin where the step size is n. And so we can think here that there's a bias velocity which is of the order of n, but because the step length is of order n, that means a diffusion coefficient of order n squared. And so I would say that the mean time for a random walk to get from any point on this line to the ending point is just exponential in the Peckley number, e to the VL over d. And so that's what this answer is. The mean time should scale as exponential in the Peckley number. This is a classic result for a biased random walk. If you have a biased random walk biased this way, how long does it take to reach an absorbing point here? It scales like this. But now I've found out what V is, what L is, which is the effective length of the system, which is n cubed. D is n squared. You put it all together, you get a time which goes like e to the n squared. So extremely slow approach to balance. On the other hand, if p is less than 1/2, then you have exponentially quickly unfriendly links are disappearing. So the density of unfriendly links is decaying exponentially in time. And one can make an estimate for the time that it takes the system to reach the final state by saying that when you have only one unfriendly link left, that will be effectively the point where I've reached the absorbing state of the system. So when I make the density of unfriendly links 1 over n squared, that's where you have only one unfriendly link left, and that'll be my criterion for stopping. And so just equating these two things, one gets a characteristic time that scales as logarithm of n. So interestingly enough, that when I have a bias away from the origin, the time to reach this origin or this final state is scaling exponentially in the system size. If the bias is towards it, then it scales only logarithmically, just as that didn't shut off. What happens at p equals 1/2 is actually much more subtle. And let me just maybe outline what happens, because it's not any calculation I could present in any talk. But in this case, the density of unfriendly links is decaying as a power law. So if you naively equate it to 1 over n squared, the density 1 over n squared is a stopping criterion, you get a characteristic time that scales like n to the plus 4 power. And what does that mean in terms of a picture? The density of unfriendly links is decaying like 1 over square root of t. And so as it decays, when it reaches 1 over n squared, that would give you the characteristic stopping time, n to the power 4. But because it's a finite size system, there are fluctuations. And here's the cartoon. Maybe I'd put the cartoon first. Like if I imagine simulating this, there'll be fluctuations up and down as I get very close to when the number of unfriendly links is of the order of 1, the size of the fluctuations is sufficiently large that you could have reached the final state earlier because of a large fluctuation downward. And so one can make some estimate for what is the size of these fluctuations. And it turns out that if you do something known as the omega expansion, which is a 1 over n expansion for this sort of a master equation, one can write down a Langevin equation for the evolution of the fluctuation. And with a lot of work, one finds that, in fact, the fluctuation part, so if this now, capital U is the number of unfriendly links, so it scales like the density of unfriendly links times the total times L, which is the total number of links in the system. And then there's a term of order square root of L. And this square root term has a coefficient which goes like t to the 1/4. And so when these two terms are the same order of magnitude is when the fluctuation is of the order.
Where did you get that eta from?
Well,
To the 1/4, or you're not telling me?
I'm not going to tell you because it's a horrible calculation that, I mean, I could show you, but you wouldn't want to see it in a talk like this.
Can you talk about it sort of as if you were talking to my mother?
No, unfortunately, I don't think I could talk about it as if I was talking to your mother, because it's one of those things that just as a result of like turning a huge crank. And so I've not figured out
Only his mother could love it.
No, she would not love it. So I have to say I don't know how to do it in that. If I could do it that way, I would present it here, but I just don't know how to do that. Yeah.
Say what that L is again?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, L is like the total number of links in the system. So that's n minus 1, n minus 2 divided by 6. Yeah.
Your absorbing state, is that analogous to a balanced state in your structural balance, or is that analogous to...
Well, the thing is that the absorbing state here is the state of complete friendliness. So that's also a socially balanced state, but it's a trivial socially balanced state.
So in your previous result, when you had p less than 1/2,
Yep.
you showed that in expectation and exponential time, it might also...
Well, it exponentially quickly goes to a steady state, and the steady state is one where there's a finite density of unfriendly links, which would mean that there's a finite density of triads of all different types in the system. So it's a system which is sort of always boiling with people, saying, screw you, I'm not going to be friends with you anymore, and changing relationships. But it's happening steady state way. Okay, so anyways, the point of all of this, I mean, of including the effect of these fluctuations is that this characteristic time, which scales like n to the fourth, actually scales like n to the power 4/3. And I have to apologize that I don't know like a good way of presenting this particular result, but it's just a horrible calculation. So that's why it's an appendix of our paper. But anyways, if you look at this by simulation, it turns out there's a very good agreement between the theory that I just showed and simulations. So here I'm showing the case of p less than 1/2, p equals 1/2, p greater than 1/2. The y-axis is the time to reach social balance, and the x-axis is the total number of sites in the system. And here one has on a logarithmic linear scale, this seems to be growing faster than linear on this scale, which is consistent with something growing faster than linear exponentially, so e to the n squared. But we can only go up to 14 sites here before the size of the simulation is already 1,000,000 time steps.
You didn't dare to take another log and fit whether the 2 is 2 or 1.5.
I wouldn't dream of doing that with, I mean, you know, we have, I mean, there's not much dynamic range there. Here's a log-log plot in the case of p equals 1/2, and so, you know, you can decide if you like this fit. This is a line of slope 4/3. It seems to be reasonable. And then here is a linear logarithmic fit, and again, it seems to fit very well with the logarithm. So there's a rich time-dependent behavior here that, you know, we at least can explain many features of it with rough arguments.
May I?
Please.
About this log. So, how many edges have to be changed? Isn't there some trivial lower bound of order n squared, or?
Well, the thing is that if I have a complete graph, I mean, there's of the order of n squared edges. So, so what is the trivial lower bound?
I mean, if you want to, this is when you get rid of all the frustrated triangles.
Right.
But you can only get rid of one of them in one step. So
No. The thing is that in a single step, I can also create many frustrated triads. Because since I'm clueless, and I could say, well, you know, I was friends with Brad and Jen, and then they got divorced, and I'm going to now stop being friends with Jen. But she might have had a whole other slew of friends who are mutual friends with me, and by breaking a relationship, I've now created many imbalanced triads by that event. Absolutely, that's right. And which tends to win out depends on, like, are you close to the socially balanced state or not? When you're close to social balance, it's very likely that you make a move that's like the wrong way. And when you're kind of in the middle of the system, then you make equal numbers of new balanced triads and new imbalanced triads.
So you have to sort of, how many imbalanced triangles do you have n squared?
Well, the total number, I mean, we typically start with a random initial condition. That's a reasonable starting point, so n squared to begin with.
And you can, at most in one step, change n of them.
Exactly. In the
So how come you can take time log n? Shouldn't you at least take time n? Because that seems to be a lower bound.
Oh, okay. Well,
I think that's
what
oh, I see. Okay. Well, no, the thing is that but one microscopic update step is not a time of 1. In order to, you know, in order to have like a reasonably normalized time, I'd like to have that if I take each link and change it once on average, that would be a time of 1.
This is multiplied by n squared.
Yes. Yeah. So okay, that's a
so that was it.
yeah. Okay. So that's yeah. All right. All right. So now let me, in the next part of this talk, discuss a slightly different version of dynamics, which for those, please.
So real social networks are, I mean, I happen not to have any relationship with either Pit nor Brad.
Yes.
And that is,
It's very clear.
Yes.
and that is probably sort of typical if you look at the
Absolutely.
majority of the people in the US.
Yes.
So have you looked at doing the same thing on a random graph with average number?
You know that is the obvious next step, and you know if you see in my final slide, I'm going to say open questions, and it's open question number 1. So yes.
So it's actually not trivial to do. It becomes hard.
I don't know. I have no idea.
Now's the time to look at it.
I haven't looked at it yet, but I think it would be interesting to do. So anyways, now let me come to this constrained triad dynamics. And the way you can think about this, again, for those of you who are familiar with the Ising model, there's Glauber kinetics, where you take a single spin and flip it. And there's also Kawasaki dynamics, where you take two spins at opposite sign and you flip them together. And so constrained triad dynamics is something a little bit akin to Kawasaki dynamics, where you have some social awareness. And now I see there's actually two women in the audience, not just one. And so you can think of this as the dynamics of women who, you know, they look around and they're very sensitive to everybody, and you know, and so when they make a change in social relationships, they consider everybody that they're connected to. So here's constrained triad dynamics, which you pick a random imbalanced triad, and you reverse a link at random to eliminate a frustrated triad only if the total number of frustrated triads in the entire system does not increase. So you pay attention to your entire relationship structure. Now, the thing is that, you know, we had a parameter p in our original model. We're just fixing it to be 1/3 so that we're just picking a link at random. We just want to eliminate as many parameters as possible. So the model here is in some sense simpler because there's no parameter. We just pick a link at random and we eliminate and we flip it if we can reduce the number of frustrated triads. The thing is that because of this constraint here, the typical outcome is that we very quickly get a final static state, which is...
But you have to have global information about the system to do that.
Well, yes.
Just so it tracks your end, but I guess that, well, I guess if it's a, it's a dense network, that's a lot of the system, and if it's sparse, like Christian was talking about,
that's right.
then it's not, then it's a local.
That's right. So the thing is that for the case of the complete graph, I mean, you typically are a member of n different triads, and so,
right.
You know. And yes, and so it's probably extremely different for a graph which has a mean average degree rather than a diverging average degree. And,
right.
But who knows, I just don't know what happens. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit what happens in the system. So the main feature of this system is a transition between utopia and social balance, where you have two equal-sized cliques that, you know, mutually are friendly among each other and hate each other's guts between them. And so what I'm showing here is a simulation result as a function of the density of friendly links in the initial state. And what we seem to find is a phase transition around 2/3. And I have no idea like where the transition actually occurs. So what am I plotting here? On the y-axis is the C1 minus C1 and C2 are the sizes of the two final cliques. And so what I'm plotting is the mean square difference in the size of the cliques divided by n. So it's some quantity which is normalized between 0 and 1. When it's of the order of 1, that means I have one clique of size n, the other clique of size 0, and that's the end of the story. When
What is the expectation of the delta? Is it 0?
What do you mean, the expectation?
Well, you took the expectation squared, so what's the, you looked at the...
Oh, yes.
So,
Well, I mean, the thing is that the mean value of delta can be easily positive or negative, and so it doesn't tell you anything significant. You want to look at the mean square difference because, you know.
the reason I'm asking is you didn't plot delta squared minus, I mean, you didn't plot the variance, you put the mean squared.
That's right.
And if the expectation is not 0, I would have expected you to plot
But
the
it is
variance.
0. I mean, it's
Yeah, no, but on average it's 0. I mean, the mean delta is 0. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So anyways, in this limit, where you have two equal-sized cliques, then C1 and C2 are typically same size, and so the mean square difference is 0. So this is simulation results, and what I want to show in the next few minutes is an attempt, and a very feeble attempt, to try and understand what's going on in the system. And I have to say this argument is very rough, and mathematicians aren't going to believe any of it, but it's the best that we were able to come up with to try and understand the final state of the system.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Could you recall what rho 0 is?
Rho 0 is the initial density of friendly links.
Friendly.
Yes.
Has to be
Okay, so here is now an attempt to try and describe this transition between utopia, where everybody's friendly, and balance, where I have two cliques that are mutually friendly with everybody hating each other's guts. So the thing that we found, and this is a part that's is really quite rough, is that if you start initially with an uncorrelated network, we seem to find that there's an evidence of an instability, that the network develops an instability where two cliques first begin to form. And we want to understand the evolution of the system as it goes from being more or less uncorrelated to the first hint that you are forming two cliques. So let's begin by considering an uncorrelated network. And let's ask, what do you need to have happen for a positive link to change to a negative link? So for this event to occur, how can it possibly occur? So since we are socially aware, we have to consider all the triads that we're connected to. So here are all the triads that I'm connected to, n minus 2 other triads. And if I am a triad of type 0, 3 friendly links, the probability of it occurring, if I'm already fixing this link to be a friendly link, I need a factor rho squared for 2 friendly links also attached to it. And then I can have a triad of type 1 and a triad of type 2, and these are the occurrence frequencies of each of these types of triads. So in order for this event to occur, I must have that the number of frustrated triads that are attached to this link exceeds the number of unfrustrated triads. Because after I flip the link, these frustrated triads become unfrustrated, these become frustrated, and I want in the final state more unfrustrated than frustrated. So it means that before I flipped, I should have more frustration than not frustration. And now each one of these quantities, ni plus and ni plus, so they're just given by this simple vector. N0 plus is rho squared, because I had to have 2 friendly links attached to this already fixed link. 2 rho, 1 minus rho squared. And there's no way of creating a triad of type 3 with already 1 link forced to be friendly. And so if you just force the densities of these to be larger, then you end up with this very simple condition. And you find that, in fact, it can never occur. So a positive link never flips in this global triad dynamics. Then you can ask for the other thing, which is what happens for a negative link to become a friendly link. And again, if you look at all the triads and compute the probabilities of densities of each of these triads, you need that the number of frustrated triads that were attached to this link is larger than the number of unfrustrated, so that after the flip has occurred, that you'll have less frustration. And that gives you a condition like this. And this is valid except when the density is not equal to 1/2. So what you find then is that negative links can flip except when rho is equal to 1/2. Fire away.
This is all an expectation.
Yeah, all in expectation. Yeah. So what we find then is that at rho equals 1/2, something weird is going on. When rho is less than 1/2, negative links can flip. And so if negative links are flipping, the density of positive links is increasing. And then when it hits 1/2, something else is going on. If we start with larger than 1/2, then the number of friendly links is increasing until it will reach a fixed point at 1. So it seems to suggest that at 1/2, something weird is going on. And so what is that weird thing going on? So let's look a little bit more detail near rho equals 1/2. And let me try and justify why, if I have a little bit of cliquishness occurring, that this little bit of cliquishness will tend to increase. So let's imagine that I have a large, so this is a representation of a complete graph in which I have the beginnings of a clique here, where the density of friendly links is a little bit larger than 1/2 inside of this blue blob, a little bit larger than 1/2 inside of this other blue blob, but that the connections between these two cliques is such that the density of friendly links is a little bit less than 1/2. So I call rho 1 the density in the sort of proto-clique, and it's a little bit larger than 1/2, and beta, which is a little bit less than 1/2, is the density in this interconnection region. So if I want to change a negative link to a positive link that's inside of this clique, then how can, let's sort of look at some events that can make this occur. For example, I can have a triad of type 1 inside of this particular clique. And then we've seen from the previous slide that such an event will occur naturally. On the other hand, another way that I can change a minus to a plus is I can take a triad of type 3, which involves connections across from one clique to another, which has 3 negative links. And then this guy can change to, and I'll make a triad of type 3 into a triad of type 2. These are 2 types of events which can occur, which will change an unfriendly triad, an imbalanced triad to a balanced triad. And in order for this to occur, now, so this is now building on what I showed in the previous slide, that we need that the number of frustrated triads that are attached to this link has to exceed the number of unfrustrated triads. But now there's several possibilities, because the triad that I'm flipping could be just an intra-clique triad, or it could be an interclique triad. And so I've got to count the total number of triads both inside of a clique and across the clique, and I have to count the number of triads of each type, and if it's inside the clique, it involves only the density inside the clique. If it goes across the clique, it involves the density of links across the clique. And so it's similar type of bookkeeping, and it's all entirely straightforward. And if you work through the algebra, you find immediately that you get a condition like this, which is always true, independent. So C1 and C2 are the size of the two protocliques that I have here, and rho I are the densities in the left side and the right side, which you take to be a little bit larger than 1/2, and beta was, again, the inter.
Where did you use that rho was about 1/2 here?
Well, I'm just using the fact that when rho is of the order of 1/2, this is where this thing becomes changes from below 0 to above 0.
I see.
Yeah. So the point here is that according to this kind of an argument, unfriendly links inside of a clique tend to disappear, which means that cliques, once they form, once you have the beginnings of a proto-clique, that they become more cohesive and friendly links only increase inside of a clique. Then I can look at what happens for a link between the cliques. So suppose I have a friendly relationship between cliques. We'd like to get rid of that in order to develop the social balance. So for this event to occur, a positive link changing to a negative link, then ways that can this occur is, for example, I can have a triad of type 1 going across the clique, and this could involve a negative link across the clique and a positive link inside of a clique, or vice versa. And again, you have to count the number of frustrated triads should exceed the number of unfrustrated triads. And again, the number of triads of each of these types now involves triads that go across the clique, so you have to have factors of beta and rho for the density of links across the clique and inside of the clique. It's this is not very fun to actually look at because it's all just sort of bookkeeping, but I hope I'm giving you a sense of the idea of what one has to do to just do the bookkeeping. And the main point here is that you get a criterion which is true only if rho 1 and rho 2 are both larger than 1/2 and beta is less than 1/2. So the main point here is that in that limit, positive interclique limits also disappear. So, yeah.
Is it assumed that C1 and C2, these two cliques between them, or these two proto-cliques, between them cover everything, or are there a lot of other vertices?
No, this is everything. All vertices are either in C1 or
Otherwise,
C2.
That's right. Stuff you'd have to worry about frustrated and unfrustrated triangles.
Right. So the point here is that now if I have these protocliques forming, then if I have the sharks and the jets, and somebody is trying to be friendly across between the sharks and the jets, the members of each gang come along and say, you don't become nice to someone in the other gang. And so positive interclique links disappear, increased enmity between cliques. So this is an attempt to understand the origin of this transition from two cliques to utopia as they change the density of links. And one finds here that this argument gives you a transition at a value of the order of 1/2.
Didn't you say that you had 2/3?
So that is like the big black mark on this whole argument, which is that this argument, which seems to be, I don't know whether you buy any of this argument or not, but at least that's the best we could do. It suggests a transition at 1/2, but as a caveat, the numerical simulation says transition seems to occur at 2/3. So I have no idea how to make this any better, but this was our attempt to understand the system. So actually, what I want to do now is I'm basically at the end of the story, and I just thought I'd give you a little lesson in history to try and give you a sense what else is all this social balance stuff good for. So here's my history lesson. And it's the history lesson in the period before World War I. And I don't know if any of you have ever read any World War I history, but it's really quite depressing because sort of the period of 1870 to 1910, you had the major powers trying to grab colonies all over the world, and it was like lovers' quarrels, like all these countries just doing a dance around their various colonies and making alliances and shifting alliances. And so let me give you a sense what happened. So here are the 6 major protagonists before World War I: Great Britain, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, Russia, and France. And after the Franco-Prussian War, France was kind of isolated, left by itself. They hated Britain, they hated Germany, they hated Austria-Hungary, they hated Russia. They were kind of in bad shape. And there was this thing called the Three Emperors League, which bound Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia together. And so that was the state of affairs in 1872. And so the blue here is meant to represent friendly links, and the red are meant to represent unfriendly links. And I hope you'll see what's coming. You can guess what's happening. Then in 1882, the Triple Alliance that brought in Italy to the fold, and all other relationships more or less not changing. Then there was the Russian-German lapse of 1890. And so now the green here is meant to represent a change in a relationship. So I started with, here I had blue and red. Now there was a new set of friendly links, which is green. And now that it's been established, it's blue. Now we have a friendly link changing to unfriendly link. And then finally, France got into the foreign policy game with the French-Russian alliance in 1891. And so there's now a friendly link here. Finally, next to final, Entente Cordiale. France and Great Britain are now friends. And the next one is the Russian. And so now we have a beautiful social balance. We have on one side a clique, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, that are all nice and friendly. Another clique, Great Britain, France, and Russia, all friendly. And we all know what happened in 1914. It was a little powder keg that set it off. It was a little dinky event. Some Archbishop of Austria, Archduke, assassinated. You have a comment? Yes?
In fact, when they didn't renew the license agreement in 1890, Bismarck said, one day someone will be a bloody fool in the Balkans, the whole thing will come crashing down.
Yeah, very good. Yes, that's right. And so that's the story. So the point here is that social balance, even though that it's been well studied by the social scientists and one views this as a positive outcome, it also can be a powder keg that leads to something terrible happening. So first point is I hope you get the sense that if we can't all be friendly, that a natural state of the system is that you try to have social balance, that you might avoid some people and you avoid the enemies or the friends of the people you avoid in such a way that you try to have all your interactions being unambiguous. You like to have balanced triads. And in the case of local triad dynamics, I outlined some simple results that we could derive about the time dependence and the steady state of that system. For global dynamics,
But didn't you actually already convinced us before that this social balance is only a temporary kind of affairs and metastable, eventually the only stable state is that everybody is friends?
no. I mean, the thing is that in local triad dynamics, the rule was that you pick an imbalanced triad and then you do something to it. So if all your triads are balanced, even though you don't have all friendly relationships, that also will not evolve. So anyways, I've derived some basic results about, with local triad dynamics, global triad dynamics, very different types of behaviors. Let me just sort of come to some open questions. And I think this is more interesting because this is the point that you made, which is what happens if your graphs are not complete? Or another way of putting it is that people don't don't care about other people in some cases. So what do you do with indifferent relationships? Another possibility is also what happens when you have continuous interactions. Some people very passionately feel about other people. Some people don't really care so much. I mean, that's also socially relevant. Another possibility is that we could allow a network, a triad with all unfriendly links. Well, that might be okay. If you have an enemy of an enemy, is an enemy of your enemy or your friend? In a situation, sometimes if you're Machiavelli, you like this kind of thing because you like all kinds of intrigue going on. So if you allow three links, all unfriendly, to be considered a kosher type of triad, it turns out you get very different dynamical behavior that we only have begun to explore, and it seems to be quite rich. Another one is asymmetric relations. Sometimes I might have a crush on Jen, and she might just think I'm a jerk. And so what happens in the case when you have asymmetric relations? And another thing is that can we use this as a way of controlling street gangs as an example? Can one exploit ideas of social balance to either predict where violence will occur or to try and stop it from happening? Will social balance ideas be of any value for this? So this is all very incomplete because we sort of we only know a very tiny bit about the nature of the system, but I hope this gives you a sense that when you include unfriendly links and evolving relationships, you get very rich social structures, and I hope I've given you a little taste of what can occur. So thanks.
Gideon has already given us his comment. So, any other historical comment? Sid is going to be here until about 6 o'clock, and so if somebody would like to talk with him, just coordinate with me, and we'll make sure you can. Okay, that was great. Thanks.
Okay.